Florida has been bucking the tide on K-12 education standards, and now it looks like they're winning. Governor Ron DeSantis ran in 2018 on a promise to chuck the so-called Common Core. And about a year after he became governor, Florida issued new standards early 2020. So they got attacked right away, but our experts here at the Independent Institute undertook an actually independent review of Florida standards, and they concluded they're better than Common Core. That's what we'll talk about in today's policy conversation, coming to you from the Independent Institute. I'm Graham Walker, speaking to you from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California, right across the bay from San Francisco, and I'm glad you're joining us today. To explore how Florida has done better than Common Core, I'm joined today by my colleague, Dr. Williamson M. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you.
So
Good
glad
to be with you, Graham.
It's a pleasure to have you as always. And let me remind people that although I'm going to call you Bill, Dr. Williamson Evers is in fact a senior fellow here at the Independent Institute. He's a director of our Center on Educational Excellence. He's a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Education. He was a former research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution for many years. He was a member of Hoover's Correct Task Force on K-12 education. I think that you have been published, Bill, in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, et cetera, et cetera. So we do welcome you because you know what you're talking about when it comes to education, don't you, Bill?
Well, thank you. I also reviewed California's proposed standards, both back in the late 1990s, and again, these Common Core standards in 2010. So in terms of the Common Core, I had to read them word for word and know what I thought about them.
Okay. So anyway, I guess we're allowed to talk about something other than COVID virus for a little while today.
Yes.
And I know we've got a lot of people with us today who are ready to do just that. I can see a bunch of friends from around the United States have joined us, in fact, on this call. So to get us going, Bill, what exactly is Common Core and why do some people swear by it while others, I guess, especially in Florida, are skeptical?
Well, Common Core is a set of academic content standards, sometimes also called curriculum content standards. And so it sets grade by grade items, topics to be learned by the students, taught by the teachers, covered in textbooks and other teaching materials. Mm-hmm. And the goal of the people who devised the Common Core was to have national commonality of what was being learned by the children across the different states. And they actually got 45, 46, 47, 48, it kind of depended at different times and whether they took both English and math or whatever, but they got almost all the states to sign up for this.
Well, so to understand Common Core, we kind of have to know what an academic content standard is exactly. Yes. And I don't quite get that. I'm not a...
Well, I tried to say it's a grade by grade list of topics. In the case of Common Core, it only covers math and English language arts.
Okay.
And so this is what the student is supposed to master, and the teacher is supposed to convey and make sure that the student has grasped it, and that the people writing textbooks or other teaching materials, which could include online things, know what they're supposed to cover, and then people who are trying to evaluate is the school teaching effectively, they might give some kind of test that's geared to the standards to see if the children are actually learning them.
Got it.
So you can think of it another way. Suppose you're a taxpayer and you're paying like maybe half your state taxes are going to public education. Well, is anybody learning anything? Or
you kind of want to know that, I think.
Well, so that's certainly how President George W. Bush used to phrase it. He said, this is kind of an audit of whether the children are actually mastering the material, and the taxpayers are entitled to that.
Yeah. What was so great, though, about having the same standards for everyone all across all 50 states? Why was common important?
Well, so there's different, philosophies about all these sorts of things. And some people have what I would call a sort of utopian view, or maybe a European view. They think of the caricature of France, which is that everybody in Lyon and Calais and Marseille the students are all on the same page on the same day in the same book. So it's completely national in format. And this appeals to some people. And it's, it's sort of a technocratic ideal. Many progressives favor it, but also some moderates and moderate conservatives also who have a nationalistic bent of some sort.
Like I can see, just as I'm a non-expert here, but I can see on the one hand why you'd want to have sort of high standards.
Right.
I would want that. But it doesn't follow that having high standards mean they have to be uniform everywhere. That's
right. They could be pluralistic. They could be different in different states, and you could have what we call competitive federalism go on. So that means that, Florida wants to have people come live there. It wants to be known as a state with high educational reputation. Companies want to move there because their employees and their executives can count on the schools being good in terms of, and the workforce that they would be trying to employ would be good. And so can be rivalry between states to have better education. The people who favor a national centralized set of standards and accompanying curriculum tend to think that people will try to slough off. They won't live up to the possibility of competing for higher standards. Instead, they'll be a race to the bottom. And so they think, put us in charge, and you can avoid a race to the bottom. But in fact, what happened is this Common Core was kind of captured, and it didn't turn out very well. So that was even to many who favor national standards, it was disappointing to some of them. So.
Right. So in other words, there's really kind of a dispute here, not over whether there should be high standards or not, but whether they should be the same everywhere, and whether somehow people at the local and state level should be sort of held under suspicion of favoring low standards. So you got to impose this common standard to hold them to account. Is that sort of the theory?
That's the theory of the proponents of this. But as I said, if you believe in federalism and you don't favor interstate compacts that are not authorized by Congress and so forth, you got to be wondering what's going on here, and are we coming to a national curriculum being imposed on the whole country?
Right.
And then there's the dangers of how that can be taken over. We can see in the political correctness things that are going on now how horrible that could be if there's only one curriculum and some of these brainwashing indoctrination people take over.
So if there's one curriculum.
So the Florida people, so many states, because it was antagonism against Common Core from parents who thought this was an imposition on their kids, either they weren't learning enough or it was too rigid, or teachers who all thought, well, we're kind of being told what to do by somebody in Washington, D.C. So the states changed the name of the Common Core standards in their state. And Florida did this also. So 7 years ago, they put in the Sunshine State Standards. But they were really a slightly modified, renamed Common Core. They really were. There were over 20 states did this kind of fakey renaming thing.
Fakey renaming.
But this new set of standards, the B.E.S.T standards, what Florida calls them, they are a genuine alternative to Common Core. They are notably different. And our reviewers said that for the English standards, they were the strongest standards currently in use in the United States. And if they were slightly tweaked, they could stand as a new model for states across the country. And in math, our reviewer, who, by the way, was a key writer of the old 1997 California math standards, and I'll tell you a little more about him later.
I was going to say, we'll hear more about him later, probably.
Yeah. But he found the Florida B.E.S.T standards to be exemplary and among the best I have ever reviewed for any state in the country. So I think those are about as high marks as you can possibly get in this field of endeavor.
I noticed already, Bill, that since we issued this report, we've already gotten some criticism sort of from both sides about the report. Can you tell people a little bit about the criticism we've gotten? That might be a way into some of the issues.
Well,
there was this one guy, I did see a comment saying...
I know what one of them said. So one of them raised the question that one of our reviewers, David Steiner, had been the state commissioner of education in New York State. It's an extremely high and important and responsible position. And he had tried to implement Common Core when it came in and tried to take standards that were kind of skills-oriented and put substantive content in them, which I think was a very noble thing to try to do, remembering I have questions both about the national monopoly problem as well as the content side of this. But he was just sort of saying, I'm here, I got to deal with this. And he, even though he had written many things going along with Common Core in the past, said, we can do better, and Florida is doing better. And so that was one of the things. Well, why did you have somebody who had been pro-Common Core in the past? Well, because we thought he was an honest, objective reviewer and that he shared our interest in having good, solid academic content standards.
For sure. I mean, my first thought was if you have someone who used to be a big proponent of Common Core, who now is willing to say on the basis of evidence that it's even better than Common Core, that's a persuasive argument.
Right. And in English, which is the better of the two Common Core standards, that's even more important. So, we basically picked him because he's good, not really because of what his specific history was on this. And he and Ashley did a good job, and I want to tell a little more about them at some point. Do we want to go into who exactly the
tell us a bit about these authors.
Because we're kind of getting into that by accident.
Yeah, let's go there now. That's good.
So one of them was Ze'ev Wurman, and he's the chief software architect with Monolithic CD. And he worked with me in the U.S. Department of Education, and he's a former senior policy advisor with the Office of Planning, Evaluation, and Policy Development in the U.S. Department of Education. And he served on the math framework in California in the 1990s, and also in 2010, he served on the State Academic Standards Commission that reviewed Common Core. So this is just a very abbreviated thing for him. So David Steiner, again, can only be somewhat abbreviated. He's the executive director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy in the Johns Hopkins School of Education. And as I said before, he's a former state commissioner of education in New York, and he's a former dean of the School of Education at Hunter College. And so he worked with Ashley Berner. She's the deputy director of the Johns Hopkins Institute for Education Policy. And she's also an expert on pluralism and economic excellence. So this is actually, although she didn't write about this aspect of it, she's interested in the fact that we live in a pluralistic society in America. It's not monolithic. It's not centralized. It has school districts and states and all these other people having input and power in public education. And how do we also have excellence in education when we have this? And so she's already interested in this aspect of competitive federalism and so forth that goes on in education and other areas.
And then in math?
In math, we had, so those two were English. And in math, we had Jim Milgram. And he's a retired professor of mathematics at Stanford University, one of the most eminent mathematicians in the United States, but also, it's unusual to have a research mathematician who's interested in the details of K-12 education. He is. He served on the U.S. Department of Education's National Board for Education Sciences in 2001 to 2004, where he was, working on K-12 issues. He was a member of the NASA Advisory Council, 2004 to 2009.
Wow.
And he was one of the 23 members of the Common Core Validation Committee.
Mm-hmm. Oh.
So as it was being developed, he was giving them advice and counsel. In the end, he said it wasn't very good, and he refused to endorse it.
Oh, okay.
So,
But this time around, he said Florida was...
He thought Florida was quite good. Mm-hmm. And I read what he said about, it was the best he'd seen among...
wow.
So I think, in terms of that critic that wrote in, Steiner has always been a supporter of knowledge-rich curriculum. Mm-hmm. And, he initially thought he could take the Common Core as a kind of framework and meld it with substantive knowledge. And now he thinks that we can do much better with the Florida standards. Mm-hmm. So, he also, I think, correctly emphasizes that the Florida standards do away with something that's in the Common Core, which is the requirement that English teachers teach their kids technical math, science, literacy. You're supposed to teach the terminology of biology and geology and
I see.
physics and chemistry. Crazy. I don't. Anyway, it's in the Common Core, but this is not what the English teachers signed up for.
Exactly. It's not the expertise.
To become an English teacher.
Right. That's not the expertise they're trained in.
Science teachers should teach the language and how to be understanding what's going on in science, and math teachers in math and so forth. It's crazy to ask English teachers to do that and to hold them responsible for that. In other words, you're always going to have with these standards, you're not only using them to indicate to the teachers what they're supposed to teach and what the textbook writers are supposed to put in, but when you have accountability, whether the students know things, whether the students knowing things, reflecting back to the teachers, reflecting back to the whole school, reflecting to the school district, these are all accountability things that are done through testing. If you hold the teacher, the English teacher, responsible for science literacy, you're making a mistake. You're just you're like in the wrong category here. And so Steiner, says, look, Florida gets rid of this stupidity that certainly never belonged in any sensible standards.
Let me just remind those who have joined us that, in fact, you can find our entire report, Better Than Common Core, on the Independent Institute website, independent.org. Kind of in the center section of our website, there's a clickable section where you can see clearly our report on Florida standards. We invite you to go there and read the whole thing if you want. We've also got a little summary of it available at the same time. I know, Bill, that when I read the math part, which Dr. Milgram wrote, there were parts I didn't understand, but I mean, the precision with which he addressed that was pretty darn impressive.
Well, one thing, when you review standards, it's not the same as reviewing a textbook where you have quite a bit of stuff fleshed out. You're looking for intelligibility and clarity. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the things that Milgram truly found in the Florida standards. And he put in his report an example of an extremely unclear, vague, unintelligible Common Core standard. And he contrasts them with numerous Florida standards in the grades where the most important concepts are concentrated. And so you're looking for that. You're looking for measurability, so you may have to test these things. You're looking for pacing. So are you learning a certain amount in each year so that you get to the end of the 12th grade and you've learned all the stuff you want? You want to have it architectonic. That means you want to have it building on blocks. If you're studying geometry, you need to have all the building blocks and so forth in there.
So these are the kind of things that the standards reviewers are looking for.
Exactly. They want things to be clear, to be doable, to be testable, and this is what they're looking for. But they're not looking. Everything has to be clear, and one of the things that that Jim Milgram found about the math standards is not only were the standards themselves clear, but then they had little clarifications with them to spell it out even further. And I completely concur. This was a great feature, and it helped these Florida standards be first class.
Pretty darn impressive. Let me also point out that those who are joining us on this live stream, you can submit questions using, if you're on our Zoom platform, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom right. And in fact, I've already received a few questions from that means. We'll turn to some of those questions in a minute. I have some other questions.
Let me just add on to what Milgram said, because I think it's quite important, another thing. So another critic of our report said that, well, why are, this is also something that Fordham was complaining about, the B.E.S.T standards, the Florida new standards. They said, well, you're emphasizing procedural fluency and not conceptual understanding. So procedural fluency means, can they compute? Can they add, subtract, multiply, divide, do all the different mathematical operations? And conceptual understanding is understanding how they work. So if you're doing long division, what's going on? You're estimating, you're seeing if you have a remainder, all that sort of stuff. When you invert and multiply as the algorithm for solving division by fractions, why does that work? That's the conceptual understanding. The problem with the focus on the conceptual understanding, which the Common Core has and the old Florida standards have, is that if you don't know the underlying math, it doesn't really help you to have the conceptual understanding. You have to be able to add. You have to be able to divide. And all the conceptual understanding is not really going to. It's a combination. You don't want to not have conceptual understanding, but the fact that Florida is making sure that you buckle down and learn the computational aspects of this is an asset. And
I would have done a lot better if I had gotten more actual computational stuff and less just conceptual stuff. Because for me, I always wanted to veer toward conceptual and get away from the hard stuff.
You're just a humanities person.
Exactly. but I want my own children, to have a real education that gives them enough of the real hard operational stuff, not just the conceptual stuff. So I guess that's a huge plus for Florida students.
Right. I just wanted to say that another aspect of this is that when Fordham judged the Florida standards, it used the Common Core as its baseline. So essentially, when it's docking points, it's docking points if you deviate from the Common Core in any way. So it used to be that when Fordham used to evaluate standards, and it did so before 2010, before the Common Core came into existence, they just, objectively evaluated the standards. And then they got on the train for Common Core, and from then on, everything they've done some in recent years, they just take the Common Core as the gospel, and if you deviate from the gospel, you're a heretic, and fie on you. So that's how they kind of approached, and they also just missed things. Like they claim that Florida's new standards in English don't. So it's English and language arts. So it's not just English literature, but it's speech and writing and reading and all those different things. So one of the things that they wanted to find was listening standards. How are you learning to be an effective listener? And in fact, Florida has this, but they did a sloppy review and they didn't even notice that this is right there in plain sight. It's possible that they looked at some unreleased final form or something like that. I'm trying to be generous.
Yes.
But it's also possible that they just did a bad job. So I would add that the Gates Foundation, which funded the creation of the Common Core, and then the U.S. Department of Education during the Obama administration coerced the states into adopting this by dangling money in front of them. The Gates Foundation has given millions of dollars to the Fordham Foundation to promote the Common Core. And so any evaluation that you make of the Fordham Foundation's work, you have to bear that in mind. That doesn't mean that will always be governing, but it certainly has to. You have to figure that that's there. So,
well, I'm not an expert in any of this, but the thing that really catches my attention, Bill, as you describe that evaluation process, is that so on the one hand, Governor DeSantis runs on a pledge to replace Common Core with something better. The Thomas Fordham Institute or Thomas Fordham Foundation, which is, we're not talking about Fordham University, by the way. We're talking about
they're not completely unrelated.
Yeah, just make sure it's clear to all of our friends here. So the Fordham Institute comes up with an evaluation, but instead of comparing Common Core to some independent standards and comparing Florida to some independent standards, they just compared Florida to Common Core largely.
Correct.
Well, no wonder it fell short in their view.
Well, it's even worse than that because they condemned Florida for not having full high school math standards. So you have a problem in high school in math because not everybody's going to go as far, right? So some kids are going to take BC calculus. Some incredibly brilliant kids may go into some math topics beyond that and still in high school. So, and some people are not going to go nearly that far. So what should you do? The old California standards from 1997 went through calculus and they had a lot going for them. But the Common Core kind of stopped in high school. And so the Fordham people condemned Florida for not having all of advanced math in high school spelled out. But their own model, Common Core,
Didn't have
worse.
it either.
Didn't have it either, but also is much worse in terms of how much is spelled out.
Interesting.
And Florida indicates that they're, going to work on fleshing this out, and they're going to work on other aspects of slightly modifying this to make it better. So, I think we want. In sum, I would say this is kind of a win. It's a double win. It's a win for Florida. They have better standards. Before Common Core, they had somewhat weak standards. I worked with a friend of mine, Paul Klopton, on looking at the math standards in Florida before Common Core, and we wrote something up about it. They were not the best standards in the world. So then they adopted Common Core when Jeb Bush was governor, and now they have these better standards, definitely better than Common Core, and I'll promise you, better than the pre-Common Core standards.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's a win for Florida, teachers, students, parents, taxpayers, but also because it serves this goal of competitive federalism. In other words, having states try things, try to be exemplars, try to do something more productive, more effective. And other states and school districts and so forth can copy from good things. This serves competitive federalism, serves the pluralism of the American political system. It's not meant to be an autocratic, monolithic, top-down, centrally planned thing. It's meant, yes, you have to still figure out what you're going to do. You also want to make some kind of clarity to the taxpayers that you're accomplishing something, but you need to do it as close as you can to the consumers, to the parents and so forth. So, I mean, one of the things that some people propose is not only having good state standards that contrast between states, but having even multiple standards within the state. So there are ways to get an even more pluralistic, yet effective, yet content-rich set of academic content standards.
So we're going to switch gears here because we've got a load of interesting questions that have been typed in, and I encourage people on the call to continue doing that. Before I turn to those, I can't help making one comment. You mentioned that Common Core in Florida was adopted under Governor Jeb Bush. It's actually really important to point out to people that the pro-anti-Common Core thing is not the same as Republican versus Democratic Party. It's a totally different spectrum of concerns.
I hinted at some of this, but I can go into this a little more here because I think it's fascinating. So we have had for decades, going back to, let's say, Jimmy Carter, but it might even go back earlier. Actually, it actually even goes, some of this goes on in the Reagan administration. So you have people that favor national standards and national curriculum, and they try and bring the federal government in to somehow either do it or leverage it. And it happens in both Republican and Democratic administrations. More in Democratic administrations, but I just say,
but the Republicans too. Yeah.
Now, not George W. Bush, which I served in that administration. He said he didn't want to be a national school board. He didn't want to be a national school superintendent. His Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, he had two, but Margaret Spellings, for example, used to say, isn't it lucky that, I'm not in charge of what your curriculum is? Somebody would bring up evolution or something like this. And she said, isn't it lucky that I don't get to decide this? You have to decide what you're going to do.
Let local communities figure out how they're going to handle stuff.
So, but anyway, Obama appointed people that were strongly in favor of this. And I explained to their kind of race to the bottom theory that they had. And they called their program to implement Common Core, they called it the race to the top, because they believed that if they weren't in charge, if they weren't leading the country on this, there would be a race to the bottom. So they had to coerce a race to the top. And that's
Florida gets a little leeway to race to the top, and sure enough, they move up instead of down.
Well, race to the top is gone. Let's just say that under President Trump campaigned, as did the other Republican candidates during the primary, except for Jeb Bush, campaigned against Common Core. And but he was even the most outspoken. So when he came in, he appointed Betsy DeVos, his education secretary, and she basically decoupled. So this was a state decision to adopt these.
Right.
And so, but she decoupled any support, any push on the part of the federal government for Common Core. And so essentially stepped back from it. And so the testing aspect of it, so the Obama people created two testing organizations, or financially supported two testing organizations to test solely on Common Core, and then made participation in one of those testing consortiums conditional for getting a ton of money. So it was a huge incentive.
Talk about leverage.
Yeah. So, but this has broken down since then. The states that were in these consortia, one of the consortiums essentially collapsed, and the other one is losing participants all the time. So that, which was a key aspect to enforcing this idea of a national consolidated curriculum, has broken down. And now the content of the academic content standards is now breaking down, with Florida breaking the monopoly and not doing a fake alteration of Common Core with a new name. Instead, they've actually done a substantive alternative, and it's better. It's objectively better. And Fordham is just being misleading and saying otherwise.
Right. Now, you mentioned that one of the reviewers who did the study for us here at the Independent Institute was Dr. Ashley Berner, who is a colleague of Dr. Steiner's. And you mentioned that she's very receptive to or concerned with issues of pluralism and competitive federalism, which I understand that. So we've got a couple of questions here I'm going to share with you now that kind of bear on that issue. One question is from Mark and another from a man named Thomas. And they both kind of address this issue.
I can't really speak for Ashley on this. I can speak for me. I have also been on this topic.
Okay, good. Well, anyway, so this gentleman, Mark, says, isn't some uniformity in the curriculum necessary to the maintenance of a national heritage? And then Thomas says, is there any great books in the new Florida standards? In other words, will a solid introduction to Western civilization be included, and how are teachers be held accountable for results? So there's kind of a concern for heritage here. Don't we need to ensure some kind of uniformity to transmit a national heritage?
Well, I think, before Common Core, we had American history and classes in this. And I have to say myself that since this approach of social studies was invented during the Woodrow Wilson years,
what a mistake.
There has been a kind of bad tendency. It's not new. We kind of always think, well, what we observe is it was ideal before, but it's actually been getting a lot worse over time since Woodrow Wilson. And their idea was, people who founded social studies, is we don't study the past in its own right. We don't study the past as a concatenation of events that over time bring us to the present so we can situate ourselves in that stream of events and gain lessons. Instead, we're very present-minded. If we're studying the ancient Greeks, we're studying them for reasons of city planning, the city beautiful. We're not studying them for the philosophic content that might be eternally true, and yet also we want to know the context in which it arose. So that problem also, that has existed, this whole time. And so the tendency is for great books generally to be a college level course. So when I was around Stanford, I'm not there anymore, but at one point they had a program in liberal education where they were reading the equivalent of the Mortimer Adler Great Book series. Over time that has added from other cultures, and I don't even know if it still exists. But anyway, it at least had the potential to have something like St. John's, which is a liberal arts school in Annapolis, Maryland, and in Santa Fe, where they really studied the great books. So it's not really, they're not really high school level texts in general. I mean, you can read some things from the American founding and stuff like that in high school, but I don't want to. So now, as far as holding teachers accountable, the main method is to give tests of the students to see what the students have learned. One of the problems of the coronavirus, COVID disease, is that the states have suspended testing. So we're also going through this huge political correctness upheaval in history and English literature, and potentially spilling over into science and math. And people who are concerned about having solid curriculum need to be extremely vigilant right now. Nothing wrong with teaching about Frederick Douglass, but I just think that, I don't really want to hold up Mao Zedong as some sort of model for America and for America's children.
Back to the question submitted by a participant named Mark, maybe a simple way of summarizing what you said is that ironically, or maybe naturally, whichever it is, it may be that a national intellectual heritage is going to be better attended to under conditions of disaggregated power than under conditions of centralized power.
And also the danger is that it gets captured if it's a centralized way.
Exactly.
So remember that people who maybe are antagonistic to the founding principles of this country they're out there. They're definitely out there in the field of education policy. And so do you protect yourself against that by having 50 or more sets of standards and competing, and somebody can say, look, Wyoming is doing this, Missouri is doing that, why can't we be as good as that? Or do you just have one and a very hard nut to crack to try to change it? And the other people that are antagonistic to our founding principles might be in a very good position to capture that.
Here's a great question from one of our participants. So it seems like Common Core has been disastrous overall as a result of its one-size-fits-all approach. What are some solutions for public schools in low socioeconomic communities, knowing that these schools already suffer from a lack of resources, some subpar teaching quality, et cetera? Interesting question.
Well, this is a terrible thing. I mean, this is the tragedy of, here are people that vote along certain lines often, and they are promised various things, and they don't get them. I mean, one thing that is constantly promised to people with low incomes or less education or striving to better themselves, better their families, is that the schools are going to be better. We would be much better off if we had charter schools, if we went more into private schools like Catholic schools of today and so forth. And they were out there, and some of them were going to offer lower prices for people with less income. Catholic churches have long done this, Catholic schools. And there's plenty of philanthropic schools that have also done this that aren't Catholic.
Thank goodness.
So the more we had of that, the better off we would be. Right now, the political parties have been intimidated by the unions that don't like decentralization, that don't like charter schools, that don't like vouchers or opportunity scholarships. The Democratic Party has gotten much worse on this. Under Obama, at least they were split between the union people and the people who were in favor of things like high standards and charter schools and things like that. And that group has basically disappeared. I mean, Biden he's just he's saying, well, my wife will be there and she's a National Education Association member. And, you're going to be helping choose the new education secretary. And, it's just, he can't seem to hold back in any way in terms of giveaways to these special interests.
Seems that if you are a student in a disadvantaged neighborhood, you're essentially under the dominant system. You're captive to the public school establishment. Yeah. If that were disaggregated and people had to compete for you, you'd probably get better schooling and better education.
There's no doubt about it. And we can see, particularly in the no excuses schools. So the no excuses charter schools mean that they take the view that the kids, if they put the effort in, are going to do pretty well. And there's no excuses for the adults running the schools that they have kids who have a lot of challenges. The kids can do it if they're motivated and taught right. And so they do things like put pennants up of colleges, and they emphasize, how much homework, and they work with them on Saturdays, and they work with them before school, and they work with them after school. And the whole idea is, let's get the full potential of these kids. Now, believe it or not, these schools who succeed at doing this are under the most fire right now. It's racist to believe that kids, often black and brown, can accomplish this. You shouldn't hold them up to this challenge. What? This is what America is about, the American dream, that people can be mobile and advance themselves through hard work, smart choices.
You get the impression that the public school establishment, the NEA, are essentially patronizing in their attitude.
And you get I don't know what to call the politicians that are participating in this and the political activists. I don't like to be really rude, and so I'm just going to hold back.
We won't go there, but people get the point. We've got a bunch more questions. We're running short on time here. Let me just give you a couple more here. One of our participants named Richard says, it appears the districts are using most of the money for back salaries that they're getting from the block grants that Secretary DeVos has sent back to the states, mostly using it for back salaries. Florida's Orange County Public Schools is one district doing this. The Obama SIG grant spent $7 billion in 7 years and produced zero results. What is Florida or DeVos doing any different than wasting billions like Obama? Do you know?
I'm sorry to say I don't know the details of Florida spending, but what the questioner asks, is sort of familiar, that money comes, and if they can, they put it into their general budget. And, to some extent, this is good because it means we're not specifically telling them what to do from the top. But it can also mean that it's wasted, or that it goes to the politically most powerful player at that scene, and that it can be captured by them. So, what you have to do is you have to be vigilant about who's on your school board and who your superintendent is, which is not that easy. It's hard work to do that.
Pay attention to the local election. Yeah.
So
one of our participants just sent me this note here saying, comment only, Governor Gavin Newsom of California just capped charter school enrollment for the upcoming year. No more of those charter schools growing.
So that happened before the COVID-19 crisis. They said no more. Particularly, they didn't want online charter schools, distant learning, virtual learning charter schools. Many states also said things like existing virtual charter schools can't add any clients, any more children during the COVID-19. I mean, here are these people who actually have some success at doing online learning, and instead you have to stick with your school that you've been, your local brick and mortar school that may not have trained its teachers on the best way is to teach online, and they're stumbling around, and here are these other people that know what they're doing. You can't transfer to them. Mm-hmm. So, I would have to say in general, in terms of online learning, that it's the rare child who has the home setting with all the equipment, parents that are supportive and knowledgeable, and the internal motivation to do this successfully. Most kids if they're going to have online learning, it needs to be a hybrid model where they're part-time going to a brick and mortar school and part-time doing things at home.
Here's kind of a good closing question, and I'm thanking everybody who's participated in the call and sent me some really good questions. I got several of them, but there's a bunch more. Here's a good one from one of our participants named Kelly. Kelly says, for the long term, this is great news for Florida, but for the short term, what can parents do? This will never come to California in the short term, she says. Government schools are run by the teacher union, progressive and Marxist educators. So what are the options besides homeschooling? How can parents be prepared? She says, thanks for answering my question. What can parents do, Bill?
I have to say this is extremely frustrating to me. I live in California, and I've spent decades of my life trying to improve California public schools. Obviously, I want the private schools to be good too. It's a difficult problem. I mean, under Pete Wilson, under Gray Davis, so Pete Wilson, Republican, Gray Davis, a Democrat, and maybe the first part of the Schwarzenegger administration, things were pretty good in California. We, over time, brought 2/3 of our kids to Algebra 1 in 8th grade, which is an amazing feat. And then we got Common Core, and we basically lost that because Common Core has algebra in 9th grade. And, I just think you have to do tutoring for your child. You need to go to Kumon. Maybe you can get a college student, or you yourself know enough to do this. Maybe you have a neighbor that knows some more science. You just have to figure out how to add more substance. You can buy things like E.D. Hirsch's What Your Kindergarten Needs to Know, What Your First Grader Needs to Know, all through the different grades. You can use this to supplement what's going on in the schools because the programs are not good enough. And right now, the Democrats have the governorship, they have all the constitutional officers, and they have the legislature in California. Yeah. And the biggest danger right now is they're through the history curriculum and through the ethnic studies curriculum and probably through every other piece of the curriculum. They're putting in this identity politics and political correctness and somewhat thinly disguised Marxism into the curriculum. And you can bring up things at your local board. You don't like this textbook. And the textbooks have to be chosen by this local school board. So you have mechanisms to try to push back against this. But, we had the last time we had a school board election, state superintendent election in California.
I remember.
We had two candidates, and the one who won was the one who was close to the union and had a terrible record at his own local school district. And the man who was defeated was a champion charter school man who had a fabulous record of achievement that under his tutelage. So, the voters get what they vote for.
That's the thing. And I would say, to Kelly that, not everybody can educate at home, that's for sure. But one thing no parent can do is to check out. Every parent has to be attentive.
I totally agree with that, Graham. And, your children have one life in which to master this stuff and to put themselves in a position to fulfill their potential. And you, as a parent or grandparent or uncle or aunt or whatever you are, you have to participate and you have to help them.
Way more good than you even realize.
Absolutely.
So, okay, with that, let me just give a couple reminders here. You can go to our website, independent.org, and find our article, Better Than Common Core, Florida's New K-12 Standards Raise the Bar. And you can look at our summary there as well as read the entire report on our website, independent.org. Also, keep in mind, just for the future, that Dr. Williamson Evers is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence here at the Independent Institute. And there's resources that are accumulating in our center that you can access online, and you can find some very important resources for teaching that are present already and will be coming up on the website of our Center for Educational Excellence. So thank you for doing what you can for education, for parents, for school children, and for all of us. Bill Evers. Everybody, please join us. Please stay tuned to the Independent Institute as we try and work for solutions that value individual liberty and the common good. Take care. Bye-bye.